Test, test, test.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So welcome. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Ar-Rahmanir rahim. As-salatu was-salamu ala rasulihi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. So we begin by praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the most beneficent and generous, and sending salams to Prophet Muhammad, his companions, and family. So today we're going to talk about talking. And just to give you a little background, I'm a speech language pathologist, which means I work and specialize in the business of communication. Mostly work with people who have communication disorders such as Alzheimer's disease, stroke, voice disorders, stuttering, children who are late talkers, autism, and so on. But as part of that, we encourage and teach healthy communication skills because the entire family has to adjust their communication style. So it's kind of that perspective that I'll bring to today's talk. I will be focusing on normal and healthy communication. If any of you has a family member with a communication disorder and would like to ask me questions, we can do so after the talk, like after Zuhur Salat. I'll stay around if somebody has communication disorders related questions. But today we'll just talk about healthy, normal communication, inshallah. So any thoughts, any burning questions before we get started? Why are you here today? Just because? Any burning questions? Tell me, anything that's on your mind about this topic. Sister Khadi?
Have to better communicate with our children, no matter what age they are at.
Yeah, so better communicating with children, and that's really an important one. Sometimes our children are adults as well, right? Yeah. Any other burning questions? Okay, I'm sure they'll come along as we get talking. Sister?
How to tell them to go pray?
How to tell them to go pray. Okay, sounds good. That actually brings up a good point, which is we're going to talk about conversation and communication skills. One thing that I'll not be covering is like behavior management and mental health. But again, telling them to go to pray, there are two aspects of it. One is the behavior of maybe defiance or something like that, and one is the communication style that we use, right? So I'll focus on the communication style, inshallah. But these are all great thoughts. Okay, so this topic and this talk is actually organized by the Family Engagement Committee and a collaboration, of course, with the Community Education Series. And for those of you who are familiar with the Family Engagement Committee, wonderful. If you're not, we are a relatively new committee, and our goal is to identify, sponsor, and facilitate activities geared towards maintaining and encouraging healthy, positive family interactions. And as part of that mission, one of our activities is this Thriving Family Toolkit. I think what we want is not our MCC community families to just survive, but we want them to thrive. So as part of that, we've started this quarterly series, and if there is a demand, we'll increase it, and things like that. Our first topic is today about communication, and this topic actually came up from the WhatsApp chat where we asked members of the family WhatsApp chat, what are some topics that you'd be interested in? And communication came up. So that's how this is our first series. The second one is on technology, and it's going to be a very hands-on kind of activity in December, inshallah, and that is again a collaboration with the Community Education Series. Thank you, Brother Abdullah, for allowing us to collaborate. And then the third topic is to be determined, which means you have room for input, right? So here is our email address. Feel free to email with suggestions, not just about our Thriving Family Toolkit, but also the other things, activities that we could do, inshallah. So now starting with the talk, this is kind of what we'll cover today. I see that the heading is kind of snipped off at the top, but you can kind of figure out. It's a little bit of a guessing game. It says outline at the top. So we'll talk about the importance of communication, communication from the best human example that we have, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, family communication patterns, which is kind of a big part of our talk today, and then strategies, inshallah. So starting with the importance of communication, let's first identify what is communication. And like I already mentioned, we are going to stay away from behavior management. Like a kid throws a temper tantrum or something like that. We still communicate in those situations, but I'm not going to be talking about how to discipline them and things like that. So I think we know that we communicate in different ways, right? So we use words. So words can be words of kindness, words of understanding, words of gentleness. Similarly, we can use words that hurt and harm, such as contempt. That is, contempt is really morally putting the other person down. Criticism is, again, implying that they are bad as a whole, not just the one thing that didn't work out right. And then defensiveness, and we'll talk about these three behaviors later on as well. Defensiveness is where you are defending your behavior in front of the other person. Then we also communicate with our voice. We can use a tone that is kind, gentle, polite, soft. We can use a tone that is harsh, sarcastic. Similarly, we can talk very loudly to the point that we are yelling and screaming, or we can talk softly and gently. So even the voice, the way we modulate our voice is a way we communicate. So our words may say something, but our voice may say something else, right? Similarly, we also communicate with our body language. So our facial expression, whether we smile as we are talking, whether we smirk or we frown, whether we look at the person when we are talking, how close we are to the person, are we hugging them, are we embracing them, especially if it's a child, and what are the kinds of gestures that we use, right? The hands crossed versus the hands on the hips and so on. So again, another gesture is head nodding, showing that there's understanding. So among all of these, there are positive and negative behaviors that we can use. Now, why is this really important? Why is it important for us to communicate about communication? One is, a lot of our communication is about sharing information, right? And when we share information, we don't want any misunderstandings to happen. So we want to make sure that when we talk, we are talking clearly and information is communicated. So for example, when we think about spousal discord, like, where husband and wife are not getting along together and they are on the verge of separating, oftentimes communication is at the core of that, right? Oftentimes it's like they're not communicating, they're not on the same page, and so on. And it's also important to communicate to convey our values to our children. So as Muslims, we abide by a certain code of conduct, a certain way of life, and how do we communicate that to our children? So again, communication is important. And then of course, communication is important for relationships, right? How do we build relationships as well as break relationships? It all has to do with communication. And communication, again, could be between generations, so parents to children, children to parents, grandparents to children, and so on. And then, of course, a very important aspect of preserving families and helping them thrive is communication between spouses. So a few other things is, children learn by watching parents communicate. So the communication styles that we have as adults are often from the way our parents communicated. Sometimes we don't want to accept that, right? We think we are better, we are different, etc., etc. But oftentimes, there is an element of that. Communication patterns do carry on intergenerationally. So that is something to be aware of as well, in the sense that there might be really good communication patterns that we got from our parents that we want to make sure we preserve and impart to our children. There might be not so great communication patterns that we experienced as children from our parents. It's important for us to analyze those and make sure that we are able to control those and not pass them on to our children. So we'll talk about that during the last part of our talk, which is strategies. Now, when I say child and family outcomes, what do we mean by outcomes? We mean their social relationships, children's emotional well-being, children's relationships with their friends, with their siblings, children's academic success. A lot of that is related to communication outcomes, communication styles, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit, inshallah. Then we know that poor communication, like I said, is one of the top reasons of divorce. And there's a lot of research that has been done on this. And I cite, all the citations are on the bottom, and if you're interested in learning more about any of those, feel free to ask me. So particularly the Gottman Institute, they are Dr. and Dr. Gottman, husband and wife psychologists who've been doing research on marital relationships for over 40, 50 years. They, as well as the Forbes Advisor, was actually a research study survey done on 1,000 couples who had been divorced. So this is kind of where we are coming from. And they show that one of the top reasons is a communication breakdown when marriages break down. And these are the 4 behaviors which I'll talk more about later on. These are called the 4 horsemen of relationships. It's like a biblical reference. We don't need to go about why they're horsemen and not camelmen. But anyway, the four behaviors that 93% of the couples who had faced divorce showed these behaviors. And even though this is the context of couples, it's the same about even parent-child relationships, right? So criticism is, rather than saying the dishes are dirty in the sink, you say you're always messy, right? So you're implying the person's character is flawed. Contempt is when you behave as though you're morally superior than the other, right? So that's contempt, looking the other person down. Defensiveness, like we said, we defend ourselves. No, I didn't do that, it's not my fault. And then stonewalling is the silent treatment, ignoring the problem, pushing it under the rug. Other things that couples said that caused them to go to divorce is lack of interest, respect, and conflict resolution among the couples. I do want to say, though, I forgot to mention, sorry, the PDF of today's talk is at this tiny URL. So, if you want to catch all the information, you just go to tinyurl.com on your phone or computer and say, family, let's talk. And you should get the PDF, inshallah. So, as you know, as part of this flyer, the announcement for this talk, we did circulate a survey to see what's our community feeling. The reason behind that was because all the surveys and research that's out there about communication is on the large United States population, which is not majority Muslim, right? So we want to see what are unique things that are happening among the Muslim community. We don't have many responses, only 6. And the people who answered this survey, thank you to them, are between 21 and 35 years old. Now, because a small sample size means that the responses can be skewed, I actually looked at the responses and saw whether there's something odd about these compared to the national trends, and there isn't. And that's why I am showing them, because I think this is representative of what we see nationally. Okay, so there were 2 questions. One is, what is the most positive family member you communicate with? And then what is the most negative one? So I'm focusing on the negative one. So the most challenging member of the family for communication, you can see 66% means 4 out of 6 people identified this person in red. Who could that be? What do you think?
Your mom.
Mom? Not dad, right? Yeah. Any guesses? Kids communicating with their children is the most challenging.
Dad.
Dad. Okay, it's parent.
Parent.
Okay, so parents are the among this, and this is also actually nationally the same. And we'll talk about the frustration later on that kids face when parents are on their cell phones. There's a whole range of emotions and a lot of research on that, but we'll get to that. So parents are culprits, at least in this small survey, and this is also nationally, this is kind of what we see. Okay, then the question, this was siblings and spouses about the same. Then the next question is, well, what is it that makes it so negative to communicate with this person? Remember, this is our MCC community talking. There's too much text here, so I'll just summarize. The first one, the majority, all 6 of them responded the same way. The theme is respect. There's a lack of respect, mutual respect. So these are the children, adult children, right, in our survey saying that they find it challenging to communicate with their parent and lack of respect. The parents think that they are right. And remember, these are not children who are responding. I wish we had children responding as well, but inshallah, maybe we'll do that another time. Okay, what is the second most frequent reason that they say it's difficult to communicate is that the person interrupts, ridicules, and criticizes. So remember the theme in the previous slide about the 4 horsemen, the criticism, the contempt, the defensiveness, and so on. You see that theme coming up here. Then attention. They're not interested in what I'm saying. They're not listening to what I'm saying. And then the tone of their voice and their body language. So these are the things. And again, you'll see throughout that these are themes that are repeated in many places. Okay, we also asked about the positive family member, and that was kind of split there, between the respondents. I'm not going to talk about how many said parents or sibling or whatever. But then here again, you see some themes that are the opposite of the themes on the previous slide. One is they are interested in speaking with me. So they're showing attention, right? Really, really important. And I think of all the times with guilt when I'm washing the dishes and somebody's talking to me and I'm not even looking at them, right? That is what we mean here. Respect. We saw in the previous slide the lack of respect. Body language, they smile and they look at me. And then the other cluster is they don't interrupt, ridicule, or criticize. Any thoughts before we move on? Anything you want to share? Brother Umar?
Are we going to get into like healthy criticizing?
Yes, yes. And how do we do that in a way that's not judgmental, right? Yeah. So Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as we know, is the greatest example for mankind, and the Quran is our guidebook, right? That determines how we live our life. So there's a lot we can learn from the Quran and Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's characteristics and behavior. That's what's called Shama'il. So I'm going to divide that into 2 things. One is, what did he recommend, and what does he sallallahu alaihi wasallam recommend, and what does the Quran recommend about behavior, right? And the other one was, the second part is, what are his communication styles? And if you actually compare that with the surveys that we did about the criticism, the defensiveness, you'll see some interesting things there. Okay, so one theme that we see in the Quran, and there are many, in the interest of time I can't cover all of that, is the importance of dignity. Is respect different? Similar idea, right? Because we use the word respect in the last 2 slides. So I want to make sure we connect to the themes. So the importance of dignity and manners, and here we have the ayat from the Quran in Surah Furqan that says, the true servants of the most compassionate are those who walk on the earth humbly, and when the foolish address them improperly. So who are these foolish addressing you improperly? The contempt, the criticism, etc., right? They only respond with gentleness. Subhanallah. Now I'm going to cite a few hadith, and for those of you who are familiar with the way hadith are cited, there is always the narrator, the person who said it, and then the book, the hadith book from which it was extracted. So here, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, whoever is devoid of kindness and mercy is devoid of all goodness. He is not from us who has no mercy upon younger ones, okay, and who does not respect our elders. So you see the kinship and the relationship, the intergenerational behaviors coming here. The closest to me from among you are those who have the best manners. And a lot of this has to do with how we communicate, right? The other theme that you see in Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's hadith as well as in the Quran are the use of kind words and the use of kind gestures. So we see, again, here we see Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam saying, a Muslim is one from whose tongue and hand other Muslims are secure. I'm thinking we are almost at October. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Tongue and hand are secure. So there's physical abuse, verbal abuse, but we don't have to go that far as well. Even in our daily life, sometimes, the things we say can be really hurtful and harmful. It's also a charity to utter a good word, right? So again, saying kind words we know is a charity. We also know the hadith about smiling being a charity. That's coming as well. Then, when you're angry, do wudu. What does that do? It washes away your sins. It also buys time, right? Rather than in that angry interchange, you rush off to the sink to wash your. So it buys time, and that's another important thing about conflict is sometimes you do need that time, and 5 seconds is we know the 5-second rule of kids dropping the food on the floor and picking it up and eating it, whatever. But there's also a 5-second is the time that they say is a good pause. Again, that research comes from the Gottman Institute and so on. Okay, and then if you're standing, sit down, wait for the anger to go away. And if you're sitting, lie down and wait for the anger to go. All of this, again, you're changing your gestures, you're refraining from the conflict, and you're buying time. That's kind of, I think, how I interpret this. Do not consider even the smallest good deed unimportant, even if it's meeting your brother with a cheerful face. Okay, so we're talking about the facial expression, which is a part of good communication as well. And then again, going back to the intergenerational kind of relationships, people said, I did not see anyone who was more compassionate towards children than the messenger, peace be upon him. Now let's move on to how he actually spoke, right? How he actually communicated. One thing, we have numerous hadith, too many to cite, so I'm kind of just talking about the behaviors. One is he listened attentively. He usually turned his body towards the person who was talking, and that person felt as though that person was the only person present at that time, right? That's how special they felt, because he turned entirely towards them and he listened carefully to what they had to say. He turned his body towards the person. He smiled a lot, we know from many hadith. He spoke in a soft tone. He spoke slowly and deliberately, enunciating the words. So making sure, so he was not going fast, he was not mumbling, jumbling the words. He spoke slowly, clearly, making sure each word is pronounced clearly. He spoke briefly, so he didn't use flowery language, because there's also an ayat in the Quran about not using flowery language and showing off with your language. And similarly, he spoke to the point. And depending on the circumstance, he repeated the information 3 times. He modified his speaking style according to the listener. What does that mean? Whether he was talking to a child, whether he was talking to a person from another tribe that had a different dialect, he tried to use their dialect. He tried to use simpler words when the people were Bedouins or non-Muslims who didn't kind of understand all the technicalities of Islam and so on. So the way he said the exact same thing, he modified depending on who he was talking to. He used humor quite a bit. And most of the time, we know from the hadith that when he was angry, he would be silent and he would look away. This is important. Did not criticize, but stated the correct way. So there were many new people who were accepting Islam, and their ways of life before and the things that they did even as they accepted Islam were, un-Islamic, because they are new. And so rather than saying, you don't do it that way, he would just state what needs to be done right? So he never said, you're doing that wrong. He didn't do that, but he said, we prayed this way, right? So he only stated, he ignored the negative behavior or the wrong, incorrect behavior, and he only stated the correct way. And you'll see that in current day research, that is a strategy that is recommended, is not say, don't drop the clothes, pick them up. just say pick up the clothes, right? So that's kind of the same thing that you see. In fact, there are a lot of behaviors here that you'll see in the upcoming slides that are recommended by specialists. And give yourself a star each time you say, oh, this is something that I've seen in the Shama'il of Prophet Muhammad, because a lot of it's almost like, he knew the research. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. He expressed love, right? So he gave a lot of hugs, not only to children, he also hugged adults. He also expressed love to them. There's a hadith that says, if you love somebody, tell them you love them. And this was, again, there are many Sahabi who have reported that he went in the marketplace, he hugged them, he said, I love you so much, oh so and so on. So he did express his love. And we know this hadith as well, the best of you are the best to their families, and it's part of a longer hadith. Any thoughts before we move on to the next part?
Well received.
Okay, now we're going to something. I wanted to end with that citation, the hadith, about the best among you are the best to their families, because this is the Family Engagement Committee's Thriving Family Toolkit. And that also helps us transition to our next part, which is family communication patterns. Now, there's a lot of research on how do families communicate. And like I said, many of the communication styles that we have are inherited from our parents and then passed on to our children. So there's a lot of research about this whole communication style of the family and how well the family functions. What are the outcomes? That is, how well do the kids behave or adjust when they are adults? There's lots of longitudinal research. And I think the most classic work is from these two people, Corner and Fitzpatrick. And what they observed was communication patterns among our families exist along two dimensions. I'll explain what that means. One is many families they place a lot of importance to conversation. So there's a conversational orientation. So this is how frequently they talk to each other, how frequently they communicate with each other. If you grew up in a family where you felt very free talking about whatever under the sun with your parents, you probably came from a conversationally oriented family. Then, on the other hand, you have the conformity orientation. These are families where the communication style focuses on sharing the same values, the same beliefs, the same attitudes. We don't do it that way. We always do it this way. And I'm not saying that's negative, because we as parents are importing a certain lifestyle to our children, especially the Islamic lifestyle, a moral lifestyle, whatever it is. And some of that does require conformity, right? So there's nothing bad about these orientations, but this is kind of the two dimensions or orientations that you see families performing in. And these are, like I said, these are not opposite ends, right? They do intersect. So you can have families that are high in conversation or low in conversation. Similarly, you can have families that are high in conformity or low in conformity, and they do intersect, right? This is not mutually exclusive. So here you have the consensual families. These are families where they are high in conversation, they converse a lot, but there are also rules and guidelines. They do all behave similarly, right? So consensual families are where parents are interested in what the kids have to say, but the parents make the final decisions. And parents explain their decisions and reasoning to help their kids understand, because there's a lot of conversation happening. The value is placed on family conversations. Children tend to adopt their parents' beliefs and values. So the more you converse with them, the more likely they're going to follow your lifestyle, right? And the kids will most likely agree with ideas that are consistent with their parents' beliefs. Okay, now you can also have other families that are still high in conversation, but their conformity is low. That is, these are families where pluralistic. These are families where they do encourage an open and honest conversation. There's a lot of conversation happening. All family members are involved. At the same time, parents don't make the final decisions. They don't try to control the conversation. So that's why there is This family has a low conformity. So it's like, yes, let's talk about everything, and you go and do what you want, right? That's what we mean, the pluralistic style. It's children learn to be independent. Ideas are judged based on their merit and not on who says them. So a little more democracy here. And the outcome is that sometimes kids have better decision-making skills from this kind of a communication style. Okay, low conversation, high conformity. Already doesn't sound very good because, no conversation happening. Okay, not at all, what we want. And then high conformity, that is, this is how we do it. No explanation, just rules, right? And that is labeled by the authors as a protective family style. So there's an emphasis on obedience. There is open communication is not a priority, so the parents don't explain their behaviors. The parents don't explain, why are we going here? Why do we not do that? And things like that. So there's a lot of no, do this way kind of thing. There's no need to explain rules or expectations. So less value on communication. Children are more compliant with authority figures in these families. And children may not trust their own decision-making skills. Why? Because the parents made the decisions for them and didn't explain why those decisions were made that way, right? Because if a parent makes a decision, we do want that. Parents have to take leadership. But then the parents need to explain why are we doing things this way? Why is it that we don't celebrate Halloween, or why, right? So because that explanation was never provided, these children don't feel confident in their own decision-making skills, and they actually often tend to rely more on peer pressure and outside pressure, because they're probably having more conversations outside of their family than within their family. Okay, finally we have the low conformity, the low conversation style, which is called the laissez-faire style, or let's just say free. So here again, very few conversations, very few rules as well. Very little emphasis on, almost feels like neglect, right? But I don't want to use that word. So there's not a whole value on communicating in general. And so these kids actually develop, in these families, they're less emotionally connected with one another. And the kids develop independence because it's a survival mechanism. Not independence in a positive way, but independence away from their family because their needs are being met somewhere else and they just have to survive. And kids, again, are more easily influenced by peers and outside sources. What do you think? Any thoughts? Any reflections happening?
I think we can all think of families in each category.
You have examples, right, in society about each, yeah. And what I would say is we might all think, well, how do I know which is my family style or what is happening in my family? And there's actually a questionnaire. There's a questionnaire called Family Communication Patterns Questionnaire, and there's the revised version. It's just a checklist. You just check on a scale of 1 to 4, and then you add up the numbers, and you can know whether your family style is conversational or conformity oriented. And then you can place yourself that. And I think that's a good way of analyzing how we're doing things so that then we can move forward in a positive way. So now the question is, how does this influence the family-child outcomes, which I already mentioned in passing, that kids might be more or less independent, kids might be more or less confident of their interactions, they might be more or less rule-bound, and so on. So we kind of already talked about this, but here's a reinforcement. So there's a lot of research showing that the cognitive, when we say cognitive, we really mean their self-control, their self-monitoring, their ability to make mistakes and correct themselves and so on. Social, we know the word social, and then emotional, we know the word emotional. So how are these all are affected by family communication patterns well into adulthood. So a lot of the research these days is actually being done on millennials and the generation Z, X. These people are adults and well into middle age now, but then they are showing effect of their family types. And conversation and conformity orientations are actually inversely associated with each other. So conversation orientations tend to produce positive outcomes. So here again, we see how it's important to actually have good conversations in our family. So what are those positive outcomes? There's a long list, lots of research on this. And the citation I have here is like a meta-analysis where they've compiled lots of studies, and that's still an old citation. There's much more that has happened. So families that are conversationally oriented, their children have better positive personality, self-control, self-monitoring, self-esteem, more sociability, appreciation of communication, academic achievement among students, leadership, conflict resolution, romantic future relationships are better, speech act creation, that is initiating conversation rather than hiding and stonewalling, online pro-social behavior. We know that all of us are online, right? And we know that when kids are online, they can either behave in ways that are negative, they can bully someone online, they can post nasty comments, or they can be pro-social, right? So conversation families are, their children are more pro-social. Where are we? Online pro-social behavior, the opposite of anti-social, right? And then parental confirmation and affection. That is, these children are confident that their parents love them, and they show more affection towards their parents. Conformity orientation, and again, there are many aspects about conformity orientation that are not bad, because we do have values. We want to impart those values. Moral values, behaviors, organization, cleanliness, all that is conformity. What is bad is conformity without the conversation, right? So conformity orientation's influence is mixed, and it depends on how was that conformity enacted in the family. So did the parents just say, do this, without explaining it? Were the parents disciplinarian, authoritative? Were they helicopter parents? All that influences the effect on the children. And so the research again shows that children with conformity-oriented families are associated with shyness, social withdrawal, low esteem, poor conflict management, avoiding conflict, perceived stress, anxiety, and depression. Since we have mostly parents in our audience here, I also want to think about what is called helicopter parenting. There are many terms, right? Helicopter parenting is actually an old term. The term they use now is the lawnmower parent, right? That kind of makes the way, clears up the way for the children. So what is that? What is helicopter parenting, like buzzing about, right? So parents are overly involved and protective of their children, often to the detriment of the child's development. Now, we want to be involved. We don't want to be neglectful parents, so that's not what we are saying. But we also need to stand back a little bit every now and then. So that's what here, the parents are making all the decisions for the children, probably not also having those conversation-oriented. Now, helicopter parenting is seen in both oriented families, the conversation-oriented families as well as the conformity-oriented families. So this is a behavior that you see in both families, both types. In adult children, so now these are adult children who are between 20 and 50 years of age. So these are the adults we're talking about on whom the research has been done. And the question is, what was the effect of their helicopter parents? So in adult children, helicopter parenting of their parents is associated with higher anxiety, poor coping skills, dependency on others, poor adjustment in college and adulthood. In fact, there are all these papers on the burden college campuses are facing, especially from first semester students, because of the helicopter parenting, where the children don't have coping skills when they come on campus the first semester. Dysfunctional family relationships of these adult children, and then poor social relationships. So that's, and did I miss a bullet there? No, I don't think. But there was something about helicopter. Oh, yeah, I do. The second bullet says both orientations show helicopter parenting, but you see more of this in the conformity orientation. The families that are more rule-bound and emphasize unity and conformity. Okay. Bottom line, we've learned about all these behaviors and the impact of their behaviors, and we also know that communication patterns can be transmitted across generations. Now again, using an example that's not within the healthy relationships example, but just to give that as an example, We know that many people who experience abuse, verbal, physical, financial, whatever, they came from families where there was an abusive parent, and then they get into relationships that are also abusive. So again, behaviors do tend to carry across generations, so it's really important for us to be self-reflective and improve communication within our families. Any thoughts before we move on? Is ready? Okay. So how do we improve communication within our families, right? The first thing is to create opportunities for conversation. So I think we've convinced ourselves through the previous few slides that we want to be more conversation oriented, even if there is conformity, right? Because that is a good thing. The consensual family types are the most successful, but we do want, and the consensual and then the pluralistic. So the conversation is a positive thing. So one is we want to create opportunities where we can converse. For example, you might have meal times together. You might sit around on the floor after salat, maybe, when you do salat together as a family. You know, you go on drives together. Maybe every Saturday afternoon you go out to eat. You know, you have to create opportunities where you're all together. And this is not only about parents and children. I think oftentimes we place so much emphasis on the children's development and their well-being is we ignore the spousal relationship. So when we say create opportunities, we also need to create opportunities for us to spend with our spouses. That might be a cup of coffee in the morning, right, before the kids wake up, whatever it is. Or maybe it's a cup of chamomile tea before you go to sleep, or whatever it is. But there needs to be a time where there's some structure and there's a routine where you can have these conversations. And once you have that structure, you're going to start with just mundane things, right? You're going to converse about mundane things, but then now there's a place for difficult conversations to take place as well, and it doesn't feel threatening because this is a place and a time where you always met for conversation. So now if you bring up something that's emotionally laden, it's okay because this is our daily conversing time. Dinner time, after dinner, whatever it is that works for your family. And you want to be consistent with it. Right? It's not like we did this week but not next week. As much as possible, you want to be consistent with it. And during that conversation and that opportunity, you want to pay attention to each member's needs. So kind of look around the table or look around the floor and say, okay, is this person following along? Is this person withdrawn? Is their facial expressions showing that they were offended by what someone else says, right? So be that monitor, kind of look around and see what's going on. So that you can address, if you see that somebody was withdrawn or felt offended by someone else's conversation, let's say two siblings, one sibling said something that offended the other and the other just became quiet and started eating dinner, you observe that sometimes that's not the right place to address that behavior, right? So this is again how do we criticize in a productive way, is that then puts the offending child on the defensive and the defending child in a teary-eyed or whatever might happen. You observe it, and then you address each person individually. And how do we address each person individually? We'll talk about that in a bit. You don't say, you were harsh. The you is a bad word. I observed when you said this, such and such felt sad, right? So you kind of use the I. I observed this. What do you think? So we'll get to the strategies in a little bit, but we want to pay attention to each member's needs. The next thing we want to do is we do want to analyze behaviors. Okay, so we create a structure, we create opportunities for the family to have conversations. Outside of that, we want to be reflective. We already talked about looking up your family's communication type. I encourage you to Google the Family Communication Patterns Questionnaire. And if you don't find it, just email family@mccmd.org and I'll send it to you. And think about what is your family's communication style. And then be reflective again, listen to yourself. How do you sound? What's your tone? What's your facial expression? And watch yourself as well. Where are your hands? What's your body language and things like that. And sometimes, we can be very intimidating. We all think we're perfect, right? Because we have very little self-analysis, and so we don't often know how we come across to others. And that's just human nature. We're always observing others. We're looking outwards more than we're looking inwards. So think about good behaviors, like how often did you share? How often did you acknowledge or value another person? So somebody walks in, say, the spouse walks in looking tired and exhausted, then kind of saying, you look tired. You must have had a tiring day. That's like acknowledging, just stating the fact. And valuing other people, encouraging them, attending. Hugging, of course, your halal mahram people. Attending, and how much do you show patience, right? Similarly, observe how often do you nag, get angry, shout, tease, blame. Very important distinction there, fighting to win versus fighting to understand. Now, arguments happen. We said conformity orientation is not always the best, right? So we are going to have differences of opinion, and the more we converse, the more we have differences of opinion, and we might argue, and that's fine. But then when you're arguing, what is your approach? Is your approach that you want to win the argument and shut the other person up, which is not a great approach? Or is your approach when you're arguing trying to understand the other person, where they are coming from? So fighting to win versus fighting to understand are very different. Fighting is okay. It's normal. It's natural. Conflict happens when you are in, relationships. But then the question is, when you are in that situation, are you trying to understand where are they coming from? How are they seeing these things? And that's what we should be doing. Not about winning the argument. Winning the argument. For example, the kids fall, you tell the kids, tie up your shoelaces, you're going to, trip and fall or whatever, but the kid runs out and plays in the playground, and the kid trips on their shoelaces and falls. What do you say? I told you so! No, that's like fighting to win, right? You're like, I was right. No, that's not the time for it. What you want to do is acknowledge and value. You must be heard. That kind of thing, right? Okay, the 4 horsemen, we'll talk about this on the next slide. So again, I've mentioned these words already. We need to identify, again, we are analyzing our own behavior, we are analyzing others' behaviors. So we are looking for 93% of divorces have these 4 behaviors. So this was, again, the Gottman couple who have done research for almost 40, 50 years, and they have counseled couples, and they have watched the couples either break their marriage or stay in the marriage. So they have these outcomes of what are successful marriages and what are not successful marriages. And they say 93% of the couples who eventually ended in divorce had these 4 behaviors. So we need to identify those behaviors, right? And then the question is, again, the Gottman Institute gives us alternatives. That's important, right? We need to know how to fix those behaviors. So criticism is verbally attacking the person's character or personality, like, you are messy, right? You are always arguing. Or on the other hand, use the I statement. When I see dishes in the sink, I feel stressed, right? That's an I statement. So rather than saying, I would prefer if you wash the dishes at night, or if you loaded the dishwasher at night. So that is kind of how, rather than criticizing, you're saying what effect it's having on you, and then bringing up the problematic topic. Contempt, again, you're showing moral superiority over the other, like, I told you so, right? That kind of thing. So build a culture of appreciation, and we'll talk about appreciating. I don't know how many of you know of the magic ratio, which we'll come to in a little bit. That is, how many times do couples appreciate themselves? And again, this research is on couples, but it does apply to parent-child relationships. These are all relationships in the family. The same principles can be applied. So how often do successful, happy couples appreciate each other, successful, happy parents appreciate their children, whatever, versus not appreciate, right? The yes versus no ratio. We'll get to that in a little bit. And then there's defensiveness. If you find yourself being defensive or your spouse being defensive, then sometimes you need to take responsibility. So you can say, if the person is saying, I'm not the reason why we are late for this meeting, you can say, yeah, you're right, I spent too long in the shower or something like that, right? You take ownership. It doesn't matter. We are not fighting to win, right? We are fighting to understand why are we both late. So you kind of we need to acknowledge each other's behavior. And then stonewalling, this is the silent treatment. There are troubles, but then we kind of just push them under the rug. We kind of ignore them because it's hard to talk. It's hard to bring up those painful topics, right? So then, engage in like behaviors that help you if that is happening. So, take a break, do dhikr in our case, or, take a cup of tea or something like that to kind of adjust that. But again, you can always bring back, if you have a culture of conversation, the stonewalling can be avoided. So this was our second tip, right? Our first tip, let's just go back, was to create opportunities for conversation. Remember, we are trying to be families that are highly conversational. Our second tip was to analyze behaviors. And our third tip is, again, to create a culture. It's not enough to have dinner together, but if that dinner tends to be a very like back and forth, nasty interaction, that doesn't help, right? So you have the structure, but you don't have the openness. Like, people are not feeling free to talk. So what you want to do is you want to create a culture where there isn't much judgment. People say things, and you might not agree with it, but you just still let people express themselves, and you might acknowledge, you might say, yeah, that's hard. Right? Those kinds of things. So just don't judge. You have to model the behavior of expressing feelings. We can't express the kids to spill out everything that's on their mind and what happened in school if we are not doing the same, right? And if you're only talking about the positives of our day, that's not going to, if the child had a negative, then that's not going to make them feel comfortable about sharing their negatives. So you have to share your struggles. You have to talk about, even if it's a childhood experience where, somebody bullied you and you felt terrible, it's good to share because you want to humanize yourself. You want to show how it's normal to share feelings and express, and there's no consequence to it. Because if there's a consequence, the child says something and you say, what did you say? Then the child's not going to open up anymore, right? So again, you need to show your experiences, your vulnerabilities. We already mentioned about the I statements. Every bad behavior where the other person is at fault, you can change it into an I statement. I tripped on the toys on the floor, right? If the child is messy, you can change it into what did I experience? What did I see? I see a messy room. I see that, whatever. Anyway, I think you get the point. Be factual. That's important. Like, this is the type of the positive criticism. Remember, don't criticize, contempt, be self-defensive, whatever, but be factual. Like I said, we are late. We are often late. We were late at, 2 other weddings or meetings or whatever it is. Just state the facts, right? Without using the 4 horsemen that were on the previous slide, and the strategies to address the 4 horsemen was also on the previous slide. Now, we have set up this family dinner, we eat together every day, perfect place to exchange, and we said for that bit to be a perfect place to exchange, we want to, receive information without being judgmental, so people feel free to say whatever they have to say, right? Now, not everybody can say, if something is really hard, really difficult, right? Sometimes people can't say it openly when you're looking at them. Eyes can be scary, faces can be scary. And so sometimes you have to do it somewhere else, other places for those kinds of conversation. For example, when I was a parent, well, I'm still a parent, sorry. When I was a parent of middle schoolers, elementary schoolers, and high schoolers, which my children are not anymore, I did a lot of the conversing, these hard conversations in the car. I'm looking forward, they are behind me, they're seeing the back of my head. Neither of us are having eye contact. It was very easy for things to be said that wouldn't be said in a face-to-face kind of situation. For some kids, it's like in the dark, right? So for example, you're tucking the child in bed, you're sitting there for some time silently, you might ask a lead question or something like that, and you just wait there. It'll come out. because there isn't the peering eye of the parent, right? So again, there sometimes the most frank conversations might not happen face to face in that group family setting. So we need to have opportunity for that as well. And if you're a parent of multiple children, make sure you have one-on-one time with each child and make each of those children feel special. Again, we know from the Shama'il of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that many of the Sahabi thought that they were his favorite, right? Because of the way he treated each one of them. Again, you're seeing a lot of Prophet Muhammad's prophetic behaviors in these guidelines, if you see. Okay, listen attentively. Look at the person. So again, we are all so busy. Life is so fast, right? But for conversations to happen, those, not just the exchange of information like the school bus is around the corner, not that kind, but for more other conversations, we really need to slow down. We need to look at them. We need to nod. You need to have more of these looking attentively, listening attentively conversations than the conversations where you're in a rush. We will have conversations where we are in a rush. That's part of life. But these types of attentive conversations need to outweigh the inattentive conversations. Don't interrupt. Remember the MCC community survey with those responses? We saw the interrupting there. Acknowledging others' feelings. Also called the opposite of gaslighting, right? If somebody says, I'm tired, my leg hurts, you're saying, yeah, you look tired. Even though in your mind you're like, no way, they just woke up, right? But still, you're acknowledging. It's important because that's when, and then you might say, I wonder why, right? You can follow up with various other questions, but the first response is acknowledging whatever they said. That's what encourages them and then keeps their mind open, because otherwise they're going to shut down if you just object or judge what they say. So if you want to continue that, even if it's totally wrong, whatever the child said or the spouse said, you first say, yeah, give it a name, like, that must be hard. That's frustrating, that's sad. You must be sad. Even though you might not be sad, but you might say, I'm sure you feel sad. And things like that. So acknowledge their feelings. Sometimes you don't have to use words. Remember, being brief is actually a good thing. You can just say, It's very powerful, actually. Right? Just let them go. Let them keep going till they feel they've had the opportunity to share. Don't be judgmental or dismiss their feelings. Okay, repeated. Sometimes you can't give the person the full attention in that moment, right? Because the bus is coming, the school bus is coming, or whatever it is, right? So, but keep in mind that your spouse or your parent or your child wanted to say something, and that's an incomplete conversation. So bring it back later in the day, the next day, whatever. Bring it back. Bring closure to it. Okay, here is the yes to no ratio, and this again comes from, originally this magic ratio was introduced by the Gottman couple, but they've also done work in research in teamwork, workplaces, all kinds of environments, and the same ratio comes up, which is 5:1. 5 positive affirmations, 5 positive conversations versus is to 1. This is the minimum for meaningful relationships, productive teams, and so on. So how can you keep saying yes, 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 right? Doesn't really mean the word yes. It means things like, I agree with you. I hear you. That's a great idea. I hadn't thought of it that way. Whatever it is. These are all positives, right? Because you're acknowledging the other person. I feel that way too. And so 5 yeses to 1 no. Now this one, you see 5:1 versus 20:1. Remember the Gottman couple, they researched couples over many, many years, sometimes even decades. And what they found was the happiest, most successful couples, when they were fighting, mind you, when they were arguing, they made 5 positive comments versus 1 negative comment. This is in the middle of the argument, by the way. On a day-to-day basis, their positive to negative was 20:1. Whew. That's a lot of yeses, right? But then how can you do that? children are always wrong, aren't they? Our husbands are always wrong, aren't they? Like, how? How can you avoid saying no, right? And the question is that you give information, and now this is something that we know Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam did too, right? When the Bedouins came, said some things that they did, or they just accepted Islam, he wouldn't say, no, don't do that. Instead, he would say, we do this, right? So you can avoid saying no by giving information and leaving out the no. So for example, if the child says, I want to play outside, or I want to play my video game, instead of saying no, you say it's dinner time. It's time for homework. It's time for salat, right? So you're not saying no, 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 but you're giving some other information. Acknowledging feelings, okay, we already said that. Describe the problem. So I see toys on the floor. You're just describing the problem rather than saying, what's our urge? Our urge is to say, you never clean up. You're always messy. No, what you say is, I see toys on the floor. I see a mess on the floor, right? You're describing it. And you could also say, when the floor is messy, I can fall. Or when the floor is messy, I get stressed, right? You're using an I statement. And then, like I said, substitute a yes for a no. So again, if the child says, I want to go out and play, or I want to play on my video game, then you can say, sure, after homework. So again, you didn't say no at all, right? You said yes, but then you gave a condition. And you can always buy some time. You can say, let me think about it. These are ways of getting that 5:1 ratio. And now, how are better ways to say? We are saying yes, say you agree, say it's good, all of that. But again, that doesn't always address the problem, right? So how do we say yes in a better way? It doesn't always mean we're saying good job, very good. No, you actually want to describe the specific behavior that you appreciated. Let's just say, your spouse did the grocery shopping, and that saved you an hour during the week. So you say, I see that the groceries are in the kitchen, right? So you describe, and that's a positive statement. You're saying it with a positive tone, and rather than just saying good job, you're kind of describing something. Then describing what you feel. I see that groceries are in the kitchen. I'm so relieved because now I've saved an hour, right? That kind of thing. And this works with spouses as well as with children. Then sum up the praiseworthy behavior with a word. So let's go back to the child whose floor was messy with toys. So now this child has cleaned up, right? So you say, I see a clean floor. I see all the toys are put away. And then you say, I feel very clean and happy when the toys are put away, right? So those are the first two, describing what you see, describing what you feel. And then you can do the third one, which is this means you're organized, right? You're putting a label, and that label then the child associates with themselves. That's very different from them just saying good job, because they don't know what was good about them that day. Kids are confused, or the spouses might be confused, right? So going in this 3-step way and saying, applying labels to it. Oh, you're so organized, and things like that. You clean up after yourself. That's point number 3. So sum up the praiseworthy behavior in a word. And then, of course, you don't want to praise excessively. Aim for the 5:1 because you don't want kids who feel very entitled or like all the time saying good job. But if you do the 1, 2, and 3 in terms of better ways of saying yes, you're probably going to keep your praise appropriate. And it's not going to be excessive. Because when you praise, especially children, too much, children at some point begin to realize that it's not genuine. So we kind of need to have that balance. Last point about improving communication and conversation is recognizing technoference. I didn't make that up. I saw it somewhere and I really like the word. So what do we mean by this? The way you see in that family, right? They're all at the dinner table, so there is this opportunity and structure for conversation, but what's happening? Do we identify with this? Yeah? Yeah. It leads to disconnect among family members. So you're physically present, but you're not mentally present, right? And I'm going to focus on the research that talks about children. Parents love to say that their children are on their phones all the time, but oftentimes we are on the phones just as much, right? So here I'm going to focus on the parents' behavior of technoference and what impact it has on the families, because that's our audience here today. Okay, there's a lot of research again on this, on terms of how long are parents spending their time on the phone and what do children feel about it. Children feel unimportant, sad, angry, having to compete with the cell phone. Okay, this is our last slide. So what we're seeing is children feel negative effects of parents' technology use. Now this research was done on mother cell phone use. It doesn't mean that fathers are not to blame. It's just that the research was done this way, and the sources are here. Distracted mothers tend to be less predictable, less reliable, less attentive, and it's also related to negative behavior in children, and they have more negative emotions. So I wanted to end there. I think we've talked about a lot of strategies, and just wanted to come back full circle in, again, incorporating the Prophet Muhammad's communication style. These are his, what he did, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and you can see that there are a lot of things here that are actually now supported by research. And so I'd like to end by praying, doing dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes all our families close, improves our family relationships, our parent-child relationships, our spousal relationships, makes our families thrive, keeps our families happy, keeps our families together, and ربنا هب لنا من أزواجنا ذرية أعين واجعلنا للمتقين إماما ربنا اغفر لي ولوالدي والمؤمنين يوم يقوم الحساب. And I'd like to point out that we know the dua, many of us know the dua of Prophet Musa in Surah Taha, where he asked Allah for the facility of speech, right? And this is not just a dua for Prophet Muhammad or the dua for the imam or the speaker to use when they're speaking. It's a dua for everybody, right? The Quran is for everybody. So I encourage you to memorize the dua. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Expand my breast, ease my task, and untie the knot from my tongue that they may understand my speech. It's a dua for all of us, and a very apt dua for us to do to improve our family communication, inshallah. So I'd like to end by just pointing out family committee's events coming up. Happy to answer any questions. And I can stay on afterwards if needed. Nida?
So when we're dealing with multiple different types of people, like if it's parents, children, spouses, whatever it may be, and they all have different communication techniques, right? So whether it's like the productive or the unproductive way of communicating, I was just wondering if there's any research or tips on how long does it take when you're continuously using these tips for the other person to improve or communicate positively back?
Exactly, that's a great question. So if I'm thinking about, my communication with my mother, for example, right? She and I have been communicating for almost 45, 50 years. So we've practiced a certain behavior for 50 years. Now that doesn't mean it'll take another 50 to fix that, but it takes time. It takes time. And I'm glad you asked that question, and that's something I neglected to mention, is that things are not going to change overnight because we have practiced these behaviors for years. And take one thing at a time. There are 6 tips here, starting from creating opportunities, going up to technoference. Deal with one behavior at a time, and it will come. And the kids are used to you being in a certain way. The kids are used to us criticizing them or scolding them or whatever. And so they have already learned a certain response to our speech. So even though suddenly our speech becomes quiet and gentle and acknowledging, they have already practiced a certain type of response. And so that's what they're going to blurt out. But that doesn't mean mean they haven't noticed your change, but they have practiced something, and for them to unpractice that and do something positive in response will take some time. I can't say how much time, but it will take time, and we just have to have sabr, do dua, and it will happen. Families do change, but great question.
Is it worth having that conversation explicitly, like, I'm trying to do this better? Or is that just like, they're gonna go easy on me so I can slide it?
No, very good question. So, we do want to express, and we said create opportunities for conversation, and we want to show our vulnerabilities. And it's okay to say, sometimes I've been in a rush, and you know what, even if the child is 6 years old, they understand. You can, use their language and say, mommy wants to do better in talking to you. So mommy wants to change the way we sometimes fight. So, make it explicit, then actually that's actually a good thing. Right now they're primed into, oh, mommy's changing, I got to change too, I got to respond too. And in the end of the day, kids want to please. Kids like that pro-social, they're geared towards that pro-social behavior. That's what they're yearning to do. And when they behave badly, it doesn't mean they're happy with that behavior. Deep inside, they don't like what they did. Anything else?
Yes, so going back to kind of changing it to I statements, when it's a behavior that's a problem, maybe affecting others, like a kid who's maybe
Hit others.
getting angry, hit another kid, how do you address that without kind of being critical or having criticism or not saying?
So the I statement has to be what you saw. I saw that you hit your sister, and I saw that your sister was sad. Can we make sure your sister's not sad by not hitting anymore? So you do the I saws, do the I saw about the offensive behavior, do the I saw about the effect of that behavior, and sometimes the I saw might be the effect of the behavior might be I was disappointed. That's okay. I was disappointed because we have talked about how hitting is bad. So, kind of do the I's. Sometimes you do need multiple I's pointing out the behavior. So I saw you hit, and then I saw she cried.
Thank you, this was excellent.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much. I'm happy to answer other questions as well after Salat, unless there's time.
Like, I feel like the fifth horseman is passive aggressive. So there's a tiny family Let's Talk.
Sorry?
The tiny URL is
Yes.
family Let's Talk.
Right,
Okay.
right, yes.
Sure. Thanks.
tinyurl.com. Yeah, there's a .com. Now the slash is there, but tinyurl.com forward slash family let's talk. Let's hope it looks like something's happening. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, something. Yeah. Can we share this?
Yes, yes, we can.
Sure.
I think it's this one.
Is this yours?